It is a pickle, no doubt about it. Bad news is there's no way if you can really know whether I'm here to help you or not. So it's really up to you. Just have to make up your own damn mind to either accept what I'm going to tell you or reject it. Tandy?
I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is Triloquy, the classical music podcast coming to you from under curfew. We're doing it remote this week.
Bunker style.
Between quarantine, between curfew, between everything that's going on, we just at home. Let's just stay at home forever.
Go ahead and lay out why we have been under curfew for 3 hours now at this point. So at 7 o'clock tonight, the Twin Cities went in lockdown.
Right. So as we're recording this, protests are ensuing in response to the murder of Daunte Wright here in the Twin Cities area. The local folks put us all under a curfew. 4 counties. I think the statistic is something like 70% of the state of Minnesota now is under a 7 p.m. curfew to sort of quell any sort of what they would call violence. But of course, people are still out in the streets. Unrest. Anyway, so that's why this might sound a little different. It might be vibing a little different, but we owe y'all a show. So here we are, Opus 96. Thank you so much for joining us for the Triloquy podcast. To the day one listeners, to folks who are just jumping on to this Opus, thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate your making this possible and continuing to help us explore a renewed view and renewed conversation surrounding the phrase classical music. Support for this 96th Opus of the Triloquy podcast comes from the Community School of Boston. I had the pleasure of teaching a master class for Janet Underhill, who teaches bassoon there. I listened to some middle school bassoon, trumpet, and trombone and horn students. Some great talent coming up in the next generation. Scott, I have to say, based on the conversations we have here, it's hard for me to go into those spaces and talk to kids about their Nachschlags and, how these traditional European techniques that, we learn in school, that I learned in school, that they're trying to perfect, how really that needs to go away. So it's putting me at odds in some regards, but I always appreciate reaching out to the kids and getting to play a little bit of something for them. I played them a Negro spiritual on my bassoon, of course. I come in character, so shout out to everyone at the Community School of Music in Boston, and a huge thank you to Janet Underhill for having me. We have a very special guest today on this Opus of Triloquy, Er-Gene Kahng, violin extraordinaire, violin teacher down at the University of Arkansas, joins me to talk about some history that she made. She's a name that you knew already, right, Scott?
I played her recordings. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
She's great.
Yeah, the first violinist to record Florence Price's violin concertos, or the premier recordings of them. So we talk about the pressures therein, what were her goals surrounding learning about Florence Price and getting this piece of music recorded, why it wasn't recorded here in the United States, all sorts of things. So hope you'll stick around for that. In the Triloquy, we're going to reprise something that we got into last week, Scott. We were talking about King FM and programming and a collaboration I had. Well, Tamberly Ferguson, friend of the show, reached out with some questions concerning that conversation, so we are going to look at a bit of that as well. The downbeat for this Opus of Triloquy comes from the late Gloria Foster, who famously played the Oracle on The Matrix. Before we started recording, Scott, I asked you who you thought was the main antagonist of those
of
series.
The Matrix.
And you said the agents, right? Maybe Agent Smith. Well, after going down some rabbit holes and all that sort of thing, I found some discussions that actually allege that the Oracle was the main antagonist, was the main villain. And I think that ties into some conversations that we're going to have today really interestingly. So we'll get into that in the final movement. Before we get into the first movement, I just wanted to offer warm thoughts and prayers to David Keynes Burnett and his family. David was an Opus 74 guest of Trilloquy, a very important member of the Black classical music community, among many things, for being the record keeper, taking the photos, making sure that at all of these conferences that there is something to remember there. Well, David lost his mother, Ruth, today, so he's going through a very difficult time. So if you're interested in reaching out to David, he's all over social media. If you want to send me a note to forward to him digitally, I'll be sure to do that. But deep thoughts and deep prayers to David Keynes Burnett as he mourns his mother. All right, let's get into the first movement. Rest in peace is the phrase of this era, isn't it? Between COVID, police brutality, and everything else, we're saying a lot of rest in peace. And unfortunately, we have to begin this first movement with one. I'm going to give a sharp to the life of the now late Daunte Wright. Daunte Wright was pulled over in an area here in the Twin Cities, Brooklyn Center. I'm not all that familiar, Scott. Is there anything that you can tell folks about that end of town? Not
much. I've been there myself once, and that was to go and get radar. The foster agency that I got radar through was up there. It's a drive from where I'm at.
A little far out, so not central, to
No.
the Twin Cities, but still certainly a part of the metro area. Well, the reports that I've seen said that Mr. Wright was pulled over for tag
Expired
registration
tabs.
things, and which I have right now. That's why this is triggering expired tabs, as they say here. I grew up saying tags
Yeah.
down south, but and also something about an air freshener was covering something that the police, something
Yeah.
arbitrary at the end of the day. One thing leads to another, and here we have another murder at the hands of the police. I have not watched the video, Scott. I likely will not. I mean, I think I've seen enough of that. What do you think we can learn from the video, or what's your response to the footage?
I was ambushed by it. I didn't know that that's what I was going to be watching when it happened. So I was a little bit surprised to actually see the body cam footage, because the police chief released it almost immediately in the efforts of being transparent about it.
What do you
And
think about that decision?
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. It doesn't make me feel like they were trying to edit down what they wanted to release, or to try to figure out a way to talk about it, like a game plan as to how to spin it, if that makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, and he also said that the reason why he was doing it was to show that why he believed that it was an accidental discharge of the firearm, because the officer's reaction does seem to indicate surprise that it was the firearm rather than the taser, especially when she yelled taser 3 times, which I guess is the protocol now before firing it. That's all I know. And all I saw was a kid who was probably afraid of dying, which is why he started to run. I mean, look at the climate. Look at how badly things have ended, in so many different scenarios for young black men. I saw somebody afraid and running for their life. And when people say, well, they might present a danger down the line, I don't know that.
Because nothing on the warrant he had was violent.
Right. It was
from what I saw.
No. It was a misdemeanor warrant. So that's the point. Do you really got to run the kid down? Do you really
have to pull him over?
No, my question is, do you have to tase him and run him down over expired tags or a misdemeanor? I mean,
and this
I
gives
just have
us-
so many questions, and I'm deferring to. This kid was scared. And so,
And this gets us into the conversation, Scott, because when you ask, is it worth it? That is their training. Those police officers are trained to do that. If he has a warrant for some weed or something else that's petty, they are still supposed to do what they're supposed to do to detain them. It was supposed to be, she thought, this police officer thought, as you said, she thought she had her stun gun. It was the bullet gun, but even so, even if it was the stun gun, it is a part of her training to do
Right.
that in conjunction with that sort of petty crime. So what this gets me to, as we return to over and over again, what is a good police officer? If the training is bad, if all of these, if the A1 star student police officer who follows all the rules is being taught bad rules, is that a good police officer? I struggle to answer that affirmatively.
No, that's a good point.
And that's not a struggle for me as far as naming the police infrastructure as one that has to be dismantled and completely reformed. But the more we see these stories, I hope that there are people that are asking themselves that question. It's not about being personal. I know that your uncle or your brother or your whatever was a so-called good police officer. But we have to talk about the infrastructure under which they're trained and their work. Their training got this guy killed, got this man killed. Even if she was mean, even if she got the stun gun as she says she was supposed to, her training has somebody stunned, tased on the ground
Right.
for something dumb like some weed.
Right.
That is the big issue. I was on the line early this morning. Today is, as we're recording this is Monday, April 12th. So early this morning, before even the sun came up, I was on the line with BBC Radio. I had spoken with them last summer in conjunction with the George Floyd uprising. So they reached back out to get my reactions to this. I was in front of the TV late last night, on Sunday night, Unicorn Riot. Shout out to Unicorn Riot. I saw was live, and we clicked on it, and that's how I learned about this murder. And there was definitely stuff going on last night. So as we mentioned in the introduction, as their attempts to sort of quell more unrest this evening, 7 p.m., we were put on a curfew. This time of year, Scott, 7 o'clock, it's still light outside. I mean,
Right.
it's ridiculous. And of course, protests are still happening up there around that police station. The police station is all fortified. They have all of the policemen there protecting it. And what else is being done? And what other ways are those officers protecting and serving that community? Because if they're all making sure that the police station doesn't get burned down like the 3rd Precinct did last summer, that means there are police officers not where they would be elsewhere, which
Right.
again exhibits the flaw, the fundamental flaw in this whole thing. We can get into the origins of policemen as runaway slave catchers, and many, 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 many other just structural problematic things. But what I return to, I said this on BBC Radio, I'll say it here. The powers that be do not want this system dismantled, because what it would take is a dismantling of what we know as law enforcement. Our very understanding of the police would have to completely change, and the powers that be are afraid of that. And I'll give an example. It's not only, nuts and bolts and structural. I think it's cultural. Scott, when you get pulled over, when you get pulled over by the police, there are certain rules that you follow based on our conditioning. Don't make the police officer nervous. Whatever he says, you obey. If he asks for your license and registration, you give it. All the way down to things like that. What do you think about the idea of shifting the narrative, inspiring thought among the people that says to them, this police officer does not have authority over you, not even to tell you what to do in any way? That's what I want to see. That's what I think is a part of the structural change that needs to happen.
I think you have a better shot at getting equity in the concert hall before you have systematic change in law enforcement like that.
Why do you? What
Sorry
brings
to
you
say.
to that?
Sorry.
Well, what brings you to that?
Well, when you talk about the supremacy and privilege that's wrapped up in classical music, there's only a certain section of the populace that you have to convince of it, the people who are fans and are going to be interested in what you have to say, right? Law enforcement's going to affect everybody, right? And so that's a lot more minds to change.
And it doesn't affect everyone in the same way. It doesn't impact everyone in the same way, unfortunately.
So now here's the thing, though. I still get wicked nervous whenever I get pulled over by an officer, because it's that whole first they came for the Jews and I said nothing because I wasn't Jewish. And then they came for, they keep coming for somebody until you're the one they're coming for. And I don't really give them any credit that they might be in a bad mood and I'm the victim. It could just as well be me getting out of line and ending up a victim.
And of course, this tragedy with Daunte Wright, what it also brings up is how there are so many that we will never know, and some that come to light later on. I'm sure you saw the footage of the black man in uniform. I don't have his name in front of me right now.
In Virginia.
Yeah, over in Virginia, police
Lieutenant.
pull over a man a second lieutenant in the military, and with both of his hands outside of the car, pepper spray him and all sorts of nonsense. And that happened back in December. And what I'm hearing is that footage came out because there is a lawsuit. Otherwise, it likely would have been continued to be buried. Of course, that officer has now been fired, but as you pointed out, fired because the footage got out.
Right. It has come to our attention that you found out that this happened back in December, so he's gone now.
So where are the good police officers in that precinct? Where's the good police officer that decided that something needed to be said about that?
Yeah,
So, and then
know.
how many more stories will we never, ever, ever, just know about? There will never be dash cam footage of the police officer Scott with his gun to my head. That footage is not going to come to light somewhere. Hopefully nothing, tragic happens or whatever. I bring myself up as an example because I'm sure there are so many other people with their own stories, and these are stories that are actively buried.
There's that, and then everything that occurred leading up to dash cam footage, that's suspect.
No,
if we don't have a recording of it, then we have to question all of those arrests, all of those actions, right?
Every single one of them.
Right.
Every single one of them. And every single one of the police officers. Look, I'm not going to put you on the spot, Scott. I won't even ask you to answer this question. But from my perspective, step number one, when it comes to much of this conversation, is acknowledging the fact that based on training, based on what we have been seeing in the news, in the field, the idea of a good police officer is an oxymoron. And we love to pretend that there's a way to go on the inside and fix it from the inside. But we need to be more comfortable. Our allies, our accomplices, and everyone else, we all need to be more comfortable with that line of thought so that we can understand what the real issue is. Dell sent me an article. I hope I remember, I'll put it in the description, talking about how Minneapolis police officers watched Zootopia as a part of sensitivity training. Did you see that? That's how ridiculous it is out here. They're watching cartoons and counting that as train. I'll put it in the article. I hope Del didn't. Let's.
Okay, no,
here,
wait.
Here,
Now,
here, I'll find it. Go ahead while I'm looking.
Okay, so is there something in the movie that is germane to sensitivity training, or are you telling me that instead of getting sensitivity training, they were watching Zootopia?
Okay, this is from Fox 9 KMSP, so that's the local affiliate. The title of this: St. Paul police screen St. Paul, so not Minneapolis specifically. St. Paul police screen Zootopia as part of anti-bias training. Let me read just a little bit. This and this is dated when? Oh, this was 2017. So this is a part of just what's systemic. It says here more than 800 employees of the St. Paul Police Department recently went through their annual equity training. This year, they turned to an animated movie from Hollywood to talk about some serious issues they face every day. Zootopia, which was released last year, won an Oscar for its handling of subjects like prejudice and bias. Now, the animated metaphor for race relations could help police in the real world see those same issues in a new light. If I didn't just buy this phone, I would throw it against the wall and smash it. We aren't talking about teaching kindergartners how to share. We aren't talking about even how to teach educators classroom management or how to teach, what we're talking about people that have guns. And there's tax dollars going into getting all of these people in front of a cartoon movie as part of equity training. You see what the problem is? You see what the problem is? I mean, so I can tell that is not news that you had heard. Okay, so
no,
Triloquy, react. What is your reaction to that? That the police officer that I'm supposed to trust, his equity training was watching Zootopia.
I got nothing. I mean, I'm sure there has to be something else, but the fact that I'm stunned into silence. I'm sorry, I got nothing.
So
I'm sorry, I got nothing.
So I said what I said. I might have to go get one of those four-letter tattoos. I know a tattoo artist here who's doing them for free. You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Anyway, I would like to give a moment of silence to the family and the loved ones of Daunte Wright. After a brief moment of silence, I want to remind people that silence isn't what we all get to benefit from. Again, living here in the Twin Cities, we didn't even talk about, I don't think we've given at all, Scott, on Triloquy, a Chauvin trial update or breakdown or anything, because I'm trying to keep that as much in the peripheral as I can for my nerves. So we have that going on. We have the police continuing to shoot people. There really is no side. Here's a moment of silence for the late Daunte Wright, followed by what it sounds like to live here right now as we move to our next accidental. Trial of Derek Chauvin, continued police brutality, and then we also have another mass shooting, school shooting to deal with. Before we get into this, let me say this to the listeners. I spend a lot of time trying to curate and figure out what Scott and I are going to talk about every week and what the flow is going to be. With all of this stuff being thrown in, there's a responsibility to talk about these things. I think we'll get into a little bit of that in the second movement with some of the music you have, Scott. But I just wanted to just pause for a brief second and just name that I feel like on this platform, there is a responsibility to name what's happening in the world, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because as a so-called classical music podcast, it's a reflection of what the arts institutions are not doing, you see? And there are ways to engage these conversations that are very important. Anyway, I just wanted to quickly name that, but before we got into it, the gun conversation is one, like police brutality, that is going to come to a dangerous head as we continue to move forward. Before we speak specifically about the tragedy in Knoxville, I want to read here from ABC News. The title is "Permits Won't Be Needed to Carry Handguns in Tennessee." Tennessee has become the latest state to soon allow most adults 21 and older to carry handguns without first clearing a background check and training after Governor Bill Lee on Thursday signed the measure into law. "I signed constitutional carry today because it shouldn't be hard for law-abiding Tennesseans to exercise their Second Amendment rights, said Lee, a Republican approaching his re-election campaign for 2022 in a tweet. So we have down there in the state of Tennessee, Wild Wild West. Anybody can just have a gun, and then we're surprised when those guns enter the schools, and there's repercussions therein.
Or that their young son or daughter finds it in the bedside table.
Now, this is a difficult conversation because last summer, and I was thinking about this earlier today, it haunts me that last summer, Dell and myself were going to Target shopping for baseball bats, and we don't play sports. I'll say that. So as things are continuing to get tense, a lot of women talk to me about how they feel like they have to have that gun. My dad, I'll put him on blast. He is definitely a gun owner and does not play that. He sends us pictures, video of him at the range showing that he's going through the process and all of that. Is gun ownership, Scott, something that you suggest? Is it something that you generally would push somebody toward based on one circumstance or another?
Moving here from Omaha was definitely a wake-up call, walking into all these businesses with signs that say, "We ban guns on the premises." And I thought, that's really a thing? Because in Omaha, I didn't know anybody who, was carrying, that. But up here, guns are more part of the fabric due to the big hunting culture and people who live in rural areas. But I also think that you have a lot of people who are getting scared into it, or they feel like if it goes down, it would be better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. And I kind of fell into that category. So I went and I was going to look for a handgun. And I think the thing that first raised my my nerves about it was going to a sporting goods store and there being none in the case. There was no inventory, and so I had to order mine online. And by the time it arrived, the time that I had to wait to get it had long passed.
Mm-hmm.
So. That kept me from committing a crime of passion. I
suppose.
That I didn't buy it, and then an hour later I'm, plugging people in a shopping center or something like that. My point is that a lot of people here are already armed to the teeth. I'll give you an example. When I finally had the license and I went to pick the pistol up, the guy that gave it to me said, "Are you planning to carry?" And I said, "No, this is for home protection." And he says, "Well, I would have recommended something a little bit bigger then." And I said, "Well, you weren't here, and and I ordered it online." This guy goes through and tells me about what he carries on him, what he has in various rooms of the house, and he even has one for the shower because that's where you're most vulnerable. I said, "Man, where are you living?"
He is so scared he can't even go to the shower without a gun. So you scared. That's what it is. You speak to that culture. Well, first of all, something we hadn't really talked about any music yet. I wanted to take the opportunity. You talked about that culture of fear, better with it than without it, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Drake spoke to that.
Free all of my niggas that they caught with it. R.I.P. my niggas that they caught without it.
So I think that's definitely a part of the culture, that fear of what if you don't. I also think it's interesting to note when we talk about hunting culture and all that sort of thing. I personally have no qualms with someone going out and being able to shoot deer or whatever. Being from Tennessee, I've sat in front of many a bowl of deer chili.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
I don't think you need an AR-15 to kill a deer.
No.
Or to shoot a raccoon, or we don't have that type of wildlife here in the United States. Not the type you should be killing anyway. So, when I go in, I remember, being here, my early days in Minnesota. I went into a pawn shop. I used to like to go into the pawn shops looking to see what video games are in there, just in case I can pick up something I used to love and it's $2. I went into one way out east, far beyond east where you are, and this guy was like arguing with the pawn shop owner about the price that he's being offered for the gun that he brought in, and the pawn shop owner was like, "Well, you say that you have X, Y, and Z. Where is it?" So he goes to the car, walks back in with this duffel bag, and is like putting things together. Like I don't even think I had seen a gun like that in real life before. It was some sort of just way out of whack rifle that a person just has, and I'm looking at it right there. Now, I don't think when it comes to this Knoxville shooting, we're talking about one of these big rifles. But, all of that to say, again, like police brutality, the culture, the conversation, the discourse around it really has to change. We think there's a purpose for all of these weapons. That man you were talking to really thinks he needs all of those guns in his house. What is he afraid of? Who is he afraid of? And when we perpetuate that, as we were saying, it trickles down into the kids having access, the kids even coming up in that culture where if they have a problem with somebody, we talk about mental health these days, how all of that leads into it. So we have folks down here in Knoxville at Austin East High School, dealing with this now, yet another one of America's mass shootings. I hope that having moved here from Knoxville, I can imagine how complicated they think this conversation should be, because it is definitely a Second Amendment, don't take my guns sort of area. So the death of people, include a police officer was injured, in this, they backed the blue. They loved the blue so much. Why not for their sake do something about these gun laws and these gun issues? Sure. State of Tennessee, the governor loosening it all up. So, I mean, thoughts and prayers again, because what else can you do? The leaders have proven to us that they're dedicated to gun culture and the status quo and the people that they need to keep happy for all of that. So,
well, we're averaging a mass shooting a day at this point. So perhaps maybe something's finally going to break. I don't know.
To make some sort of musical spin here, again, Austin East High School. Now, for folks who don't know Knoxville, this school is in a predominantly black part of town. It's a predominantly black school. There's some black history connected with Austin East High School. Austin High School and East High School actually used to be two schools, and with desegregation and that sort of thing, they had to combine two schools. So that's how you get Austin East High School. That's a long story short. One of the really beautiful things about this school is that it's the only place in the city and likely in East Tennessee where, as a high school student, you can study West African drumming. That is a part of the curriculum, and as they say over there at that school, they save it for the best students. Most times the young men do the drumming, and they teach the correlative dancing to the young women, and they have all these performances. When I was down there with the Knoxville Symphony, the music director, Aaron Demergen, always made a point to sort of integrate what they were doing into what we were doing, especially when it came to kids' concerts and, those field trip concerts that people make and go on to. When I left the symphony to move to Minnesota, on their upcoming season even, the Austin East High School African Drum and Dance Ensemble was a part of the subscription series. So, Aram had the foresight to not only put this group of musicians in front of kids, but in front of the String of Pearls and the Fur Coats as well, which I think is really incredible. So, as we continue to, again, send warm thoughts to everyone down there, I wanted to shine a positive light somewhere that I could on this story, and that's with the Austin East High School Drum and Dance Ensemble. So here's a little bit of their music, of one of their performances to get us into the final accidental for today. Scott, last week when you gave a shout out to DMX, I won't say glossed over it, but wanted to move on because I was hoping for the best. At that point,
Sure.
he was in the hospital, and I was hopeful that he would come out of this. Well, as the world has learned, DMX has passed away. Earl Simmons, his government name, his birth name, first artist to see his first 5 albums go to #1 on the Billboard chart. He was foundational to the Ruff Ryders record label and the whole crew and the culture of so-called rough riding and all that sort of thing as it intersects with hip hop. A classic artist who is pivotal to American music and American history that I wanted to make sure that we named before we got out of the accidentals this week. Do you have any particular DMX memories or stories considering how broad his reach was as an artist, despite being a hip hop artist, you know?
Yeah, he was a good actor too.
That's
So,
right. That's
yeah.
right.
And it seemed like he had hit a level that, yeah, I want to say Public Enemy. Public Enemy you didn't really hear on the radio,
Right.
but
Right.
I guess you could also say that DMX was what they put in whenever, like in the white shows, the white TV shows or movies, whenever they do a cutaway to something hard, it's always a DMX tune underneath it. Like X gonna bring it to you, or Party Up.
And I think one thing to note, on that line is that X had that instrument. When we talk about rap, when we talk
Right.
about hip hop, it's more than just rhyming words. It's about having that voice. Opera singers, have to be born with a certain gift and a certain voice. I think DMX had a very unique instrument in that regard, and I think that lent itself to the general aesthetic of his music.
Right. So, like at karaoke, if I tried to do a DMX track, it would not
me,
go over.
or me either.
It wouldn't go over. Right.
Because it's so legendary and so unique.
Check it. I'm starting to get a little too big for the cage that I've been trapped in. Cats know what's the problem. Went from robbing to rapping. Guns got the clapping. Another trip to the mall. We all know why it's happening. Another bit by the dog. When there's nothing left to eat. I hate to wear my soul. Self-destructive. But I don't give a if I go. I know I've been told I don't give a about living, killing other dogs, catching cats, chasing pigeons. Got me itching to bring back the beast from within. What I catch, I'ma eat. In the streets, I'ma
I don't want to spend long here because I know we're already running long, but to tie DMX in with what we're talking about with the arts and classical music, when I was in middle school, first starting to get into band, that was when DMX was really on the radio, really playing the big shows, so we all just knew his name and knew his music and knew his sounds. One of the tunes that I'm sure everyone sort of thinks about when they think of DMX is the Ruff Ryders Anthem.
Sure.
I think that piece is significant because on our instruments with my bassoon, with all of our friends learned, we all know 4 notes. We learned hey diddle diddle or whatever the white stuff was in the book. But we could also play that Ruff Ryders theme anthem because it was just those particular notes. What if, somewhere in the country at that point, there was a beginning band director who wrote that out or whatever and made that connection with his students and got his kids more engaged with this instrument that they're holding than they would otherwise with something else. So, when I think about DMX, there's all sorts of tunes and all sorts of stories we can get into. I want to highlight the Ruff Ryders Anthem, not only as a foundational work in his catalog and in the culture that he built and represents, but as something that connected to so many folks like me who are just trying to learn an instrument and on our so-called classical journey. So here's a little bit of that Ruff Ryders Anthem as we move into the second movement.
Something new. Stop, drop, shut 'em down, open up shop. Oh, no, that's how Ruff Ryders roll. Stop, drop, shut 'em down, open up shop. Oh, no, that's how Ruff Ryders roll. Niggas wanna try, niggas wanna lie, then niggas wonder why, niggas wanna die. All I know is pain, all I feel is rain. How can I maintain with that shit on my
Scott, off the mic when we were reminiscing about DMX, you were talking about some of the different sound effects that DMX would make with his instrument, with his voice. But folks will remember there would be a lot of barking and a lot of other sounds, in his music. Maybe they didn't necessarily, speak to the message, weren't a part of the lyrics, but
It's the
were a part of the
aesthetic.
feel, the aesthetic. And I think, that translates beyond hip hop as well into something you've brought in this week, right?
Well, let's not let's not take for granted the various calls and responses that happen in rap and hip hop music.
Oh
Just,
yeah,
hey!
there's a whole ad lib track, like
Sure. Okay.
you're playing the thing and then reacting to your own track.
Right, and then reacting off of people's
Right.
response to that. So, and DMX certainly, I can't make his sounds. I'm not even going to try.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about.
The
different-
world knows.
Just like Tom Waits does it too. And this past week I was listening to Dawn Upshaw. What an instrument!
Now, who is Dawn Upshaw?
Dawn Upshaw is a soprano who was born in Nashville, Tennessee. As far as I'm concerned, every single recording that I have heard her do, it becomes the benchmark recording. It becomes the one that I always seek out and the ones that I point people to when they're looking for a suggestion.
Yeah.
And Joseph Canteloube's Songs of the Auvergne is one where gibberish and nonsense singing comes into play. And I think that speaks to how oftentimes the melody and what you do with the sound with your voice is more important than the words, don't you think?
Yeah. I definitely think in some of my favorite songs, you have what I call the musical cry or the musical breakdown, where the lyric for 16 bars is only ooh or ah or something else. But what's being put forward, we talked about this in I Care by Beyonce, it's painting the picture, the musical picture of being in your bedroom, tossing and turning in the middle of your living room floor, driving in traffic, just breaking down. So yeah, I definitely agree, and I think that's interesting to explore in all music. I think it's interesting that you found a way to connect it to Western classical here.
Well, also let's keep in mind that I don't understand all of the rap lyrics unless I've got them in front of me. So oftentimes that just sounds like they're, hey.
In the same way that no person that I have ever met knows all of the instrumentation in a score as they're listening to a symphony, right? But we don't sideline that. You're reminding me of my pin suite right now. We love to say, well, I don't understand rap, so okay, but you don't understand the Beethoven either. You just think you do. So, but anyway, that's my point there. But anyway, thanks for bringing that in. What is this piece again? Songs of the Auvergne.
Songs of the Auvergne. It's a region in France. Just think like rolling hills and idyllic mountain landscapes. Shepherds and no troubles.
You talk about the Auvergne and these idyllic pastoral pictures, right? Mm-hmm. For me growing up, those were images that I only saw, at least in real life, when it came time for the family road trips. So when I think about the Auvergne, maybe the American South Auvergne, the pastoral South in the less violent way that, Nina Simone once said the pastoral South. She was talking about something else, just for the folks who are really down with the music. But anyway, when I think about a pastoral South in a light way, as you were talking about with the Auvergne and all of those childhood family trips, I think about the artist Anita Baker. Now, that is not why I brought her in today. I just like to show you that I'm good at my segues and making everything connect. Are y'all taking notes, radio hosts out there?
Look at it.
Anyway. So back to DMX quickly. So one thing that I saw was that Beyonce and Jay-Z, again, Beyonce is always here to do something good for the people. They bought all of DMX's masters and are giving them to the kids.
Cool.
So that they can benefit from all that. They don't have to worry about the record
Cool.
labels and X, Y, and Z. That is that conversation is more and more and more important every day because we're seeing how it manifests. The artist Anita Baker, an artist, I went through the time talking about the family trips. The connection there is that when we would go on family trips, my mom needs to be able to go to sleep because she does not want to be awake in the car for very long. Anita Baker puts her in her mode, puts her into her mood. And so before we really get out of town good, my mom is asleep, but we have an Anita Baker album to enjoy. And I don't even say that jokingly because when I think about her music and her aesthetic, I just get so many of those feels from just the nostalgia there. Anyway, so Anita Baker, with all of the hits, with all of the people that she has impacted with her music, is fighting for her own masters. And I have an article here. Let me pull this up quickly. I'm reading from Essence. The title is Anita Baker asks fans to stop streaming her music in efforts to retrieve her masters. Despite a legendary catalog of music that includes 5 platinum-selling albums, R&B icon Anita Baker is now asking fans to halt the purchase and streaming of her music. In a host of tweets, Baker disclosed a battle she's currently embroidered in with her label, commenting on how she's miraculously outlived her artist contracts. The Detroit native pointed out that her rightfully owned masters are still not in her possession. So when we talk about Scott, don't stream it, don't buy it, she's saying that the money is not going to me. We need to fix this if y'all are really my fans. I don't know if you were in on this news. I forget if we talked about it on Triloquy. Dave Chappelle had something similar going on. He asked folks not to stream the Chappelle show on one of the things, and they got that worked out. So that's what we're dealing with here with Anita Baker. It breaks my heart because there's Anita Baker in my phone because, again, nostalgia and sometimes going back to it. In the rough week we've had, I found myself on some Anita Baker, but now I'm like, well, damn, and should I not? What's going on? What do you think about that whole part of the conversation? We've talked about what it means to own your music. For folks who don't know, the masters are like your originals, right? Like the of your music. So we can go into the ownership conversation, but really now we're talking about the people supporting a cause more than they're supporting their desire to get from you what they want. What do you think about that part of it?
First off, it's an interesting point that she brought up, that she outlived the contract.
Yeah.
That makes me wonder how long did they think she was going to live? I mean, did they write it?
And SMT as well. They
So
thought she would be out of here.
That's what I'm wondering.
Right.
And so now if she were to get any money from spins on a streaming service or a purchase on iTunes or whatever, she's not seeing any of that, huh?
She's not seeing enough of it, for whatever she's seeing or isn't seeing. Her point is don't stream it,
right?
And until I get my stuff together. Do you? I mean,
it seems to me that she's probably got enough clout with the climate that we have now that I think that she could probably get this resolved pretty quickly, don't you?
I hope so. This has been going on for a little minute, though. The article I'm reading from is March 15th. So I think as we're recording this, we're still in a little bit of a brawl. But I'm bringing in Anita Baker for the second movement for me this week again, because when I was thinking about what Beyonce and Jay-Z did for the kids and the family of DMX as far as masters, when I just noticed that I found myself back in my mind on those family trips in my earbuds here in my apartment listening to Anita Baker, that sort of cross-pollination, was an interesting intersection, and I thought I would, see what you think about that. Waits. You bring up the name Waits all the time.
Tom Waits.
If he got on TV, got on the internet and said they're not doing me right, don't stream any of my stuff, would you not? Could you not?
That already happened.
Oh, that
Yeah,
that was a thing.
He had something happen. Yeah, like half of his catalog was something with a former manager that he was bilked out of 80% of his earnings for that.
So
Yeah.
so did you
So-
stop streaming?
there,
That's my question. Did you stop streaming?
all of it was resolved before streaming services even came about. So
Oh, would all right? Well, then hypothetically, would you have? Would you have been like, I'm with you, Mr. Waits. I'm not gonna,
I would say yes, and I'll go over and I'll just put the CD in the CD player because I own that media.
I guess that's the important part about owning the media, huh?
I
and
own
see,
the
also
media.
you understand ownership there, huh?
I understand that ownership. And plus,
All right.
I'll probably go and spend the money to get them on LP now, too, since I've got a good record player. So, yeah, Tom wins.
Well, concerning Anita Baker,
Anita wins.
what do we think? I suppose we aren't going to put her on the Triloquy tracks. We aren't going to encourage people to stream, but we can
point.
put a little bit here just to remind the people. So hopefully you own your Anita Baker in the way that my parents, especially my mom, own the Anita Baker. Even Scott, as I think about the song that I want to share, Giving You the Best That I Got, I feel like I got to get into my smooth voice for promote it, again, for the
Go ahead.
people listening. Imagine, and I'll add to this for the family trips. It's always late at night because my dad also wanted the kids to sleep. And he felt like it would be easier for us to sleep and to, leave him alone as he's driving if we did overnight. My dad also worked an overnight job, so that kind of ran in line with it. So imagine it's late at night, just a star-filled sky out there in the middle of nowhere. You have no idea where you are. All you know is that your CD player is right there. And you know that when you press 1, you hear the smooth sounds of a woman who's going to let you know that not only is it all right, but she's giving you the best that she's got. Here's Giving You the Best That I Got, a legendary composition by the great Anita Baker.
Ain't there something I can give you in exchange for everything you give to me? Read my mind, you make me feel just fine when I think my peace of mind is out of reach. The scales are sometimes unbalanced, and you bear the weight of all that has to be. I hope you see that you can lean on.
So once again, Er-Gene Kahng is a violinist, lived in Los Angeles for much of her life, is now based in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Northwest Arkansas, University of Arkansas violin professor, who famously, in an effort to learn more about Arkansas and her then new home, some of the local composers, the local art, local history. Of course, Scott, as we know, Florence Price is a huge name, of course, when we talk about women composers and Afro-American composers, but Arkansas composers as an Arkansas native. Chicago also claims her as well, but we really attribute her home to Arkansas. So Er-Gene Kahng talks about her journey, learning about Florence Price being behind the premiere recording of her violin concerto, how that concerto was received over across seas, and lots in between. But to get us into my conversation with Er-Gene Kahng, here's a little bit of her recording of Florence Price's violin concerto. So hope you enjoy this.
Arkansas, to me, when I first took this job at University of Arkansas, obviously the mission of teaching was what brought me here. But to be honest, I saw it as sort of an incomplete bargain or exchange.
Sure.
I sort of thought, well, I'm moving for a more stable job, but I'm also giving up the kind of dynamic excitement of living in a city and all the things that might come with it, right? So I moved here in 2007, pre-housing crisis, but it was also a much smaller city in some ways back then. Within the last 14 years, I've seen a huge trajectory for growth, which I think would not have been possible if I had been living in an already established city like New York or LA. And so that was something I did not anticipate. However, when I first arrived, you flew into XNA, Garrett. So you know, when you fly in, it's a small regional airport.
Yep.
It takes no time to check out. I think even before the airport expansion, maybe there were 3 or 4 terminals. This was of course pre-COVID, and so the idea of traffic, even in an airport, to me, it was very quaint. And I hope I don't sound too sort of I don't know. Like I'm sort of patting the town on its head by saying that. But I just thought, wow, I feel like this is what the 1950s might have been like in LA, or, just like something from a different time. And I'm just going to be real. It seemed very white.
Yeah.
And it still is very white. And so that to me, I think, being a racial minority, I'm not unaccustomed to being in majority white spaces, but I wasn't accustomed to, I think, the percentage combined with the small town feel, combined with my perceptions of being in the South and historically knowing the restrictions and the racial history of Jim Crow and slavery. I brought all of those stereotypes and biases. And so I think some were self-fulfilling prophecies, and having the benefit of living here 14 years, I've seen also what has been possible. So, I think the biggest thing, Garrett, is just there is an interest to create a rich cultural tapestry here. And I think some of it is very much looking towards large cities, but I think there is, interestingly, also an interest to explore and really celebrate in some ways what local creatives would consider the quintessential Arkansan cultural spirit, which, I mean, every artist has a different idea of what that means. And of course, this ties into a much larger idea of what is the American identity. To talk about what is the Arkansan identity, maybe you also have to kind of funnel it larger and talk about what the American identity is. And, America is very much a country of immigrants, a country of a lot of people moving to seek opportunities, to quest as artists for a home, a place where they can economically feel liberated, and a place where they can also feel culturally welcomed. And I think it's very much in the American spirit in some ways to constantly search for that and to move in search of that, as opposed to necessarily being rooted in your hometown of birth for your entire life.
Right.
And so Arkansas, especially the Northwest Arkansas area where I'm more familiar, is very much a city, I think, of transplants. I think one of the connecting conversations, even amongst artists, is where did you practice art first? What brought you here? What will make you feel at home? What are the things that you hope for? And I think many of the cultural arts organizations in the state of Arkansas and also within this area is very much invested in, I would almost say, propping up that Arkansan pride, but also, again, exploring this question of what is quintessentially Arkansan.
Yeah. And, with your describing Arkansas, specifically Northwest Arkansas, as this place of development and discovery, that must impact your approach to teaching our Arkansan violinists.
Oh, yes. I think what has been interesting for me, Garrett, is, at this sort of intersection in our lives, still in the middle of the pandemic, still dealing with, the events of last summer, which honestly, growing up in LA, I dealt with Rodney King.
Right,
and
92, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm still processing that. And then, here I was sort of in lockdown and reading about George Floyd and seeing all the protests across the country. All of that just to say, I'm still processing what my relationship to classical music is, because so much of classical music, as you know, in my earlier training, and maybe even still today, deals with sort of looking with a very rose-colored pair of glasses towards history, and also a very selective view of history. And so I will be the first one to admit, as an immigrant, I subconsciously and consciously try to always assess my success in life and as an artist based on my perceived proximity to whiteness, both in terms of classical music, but also in society. And so I was very much drawn to the very traditional definitions of prestige. Did I achieve X? Did I go to school Y? Did I have this on my resume? And very much seeking the affirmation of those gatekeepers. So to come back to your question of arcans and violinists, classical music is not a huge cultural, historical product here, as you can imagine. If anything, bluegrass and fiddling, and if anything, just sort of the exact opposite of what classical music traditionally tries to uphold, elitism and wealth and exclusivity, and certainly whiteness, but a white European kind of whiteness. Especially string music has an aristocratic background as well, playing for the kings and queens and the monarchs in courts. So, and also often, of course, historically based in patronage, and so all of that to say there is a divide for sure, where many of the students will say, I appreciate classical and that's how it's being taught. But in my downtime, I'll always play, and they'll fill in the blank with something that's not non-classical. And also when they don't even have their instruments, they will not listen to classical at all either. I think a survey that was done, which is still relevant, is classical music still remains to be the lowest percentage of genres of styles that college students will listen to. And it's associated with being snooty. And I think, there was a certain point at which classical music celebrated that, and it was sort of a shorthand for social standing and class for some people. And so I really do think it's classical music's doing. But the other side to that is that, many arcans and violinists, for example, they don't want to buy that, and they don't buy it. And so I am in an interesting situation where the curricula that I was given as a student is the one that I feel best equipped to pass on, because that's what I have spent most of my time pursuing, and most of my time being told was the path to success. And the path to success also, just in practical terms, meaning how do you get a job in our profession? And yet I am at a point with especially my Florence Price work where I just find myself thinking about ways to subtly disrupt the system, basically. I mean, it would be so, I suppose, alluring to just feel like I could burn the house down, single-handedly. But we all work in institutions with parameters and compromises and accommodations that we have to make. And I think we all, at the end, have to look in the mirror and sort of say, well, what are some things that I'm willing to let slide for now? What are some things that are non-negotiables for me, enough that, I would be willing to lose my job over issue X or value X? And so I think those are the internal introspective questions. And of course, these things have many layers, right? Because there is the bureaucracy of a university. For a state university, there's also state mandates, federal mandates. And so there are definitely lots of limitations, but I am encouraged by sort of the grassroots and local efforts to at least bring this to the fore as an issue. And I think the one great thing, or there are many great things, but one of the great things that I have been able to explore in the last few years is to develop, I think, a more close relationship with students that, again, may not be traditional. My violin lessons, for example, always held the teacher at a very distant and high pedestal. Oh, yeah. And so even a question like asking my teacher, where do you go to shop for your groceries, or how are your children doing, seemed like I was crossing a line. It was just about violin. So violin was very much the center of the relationship. And I feel like I'm able now to decenter that and make the person, the center of the relationship, where we talk about violin, but I still have a chance to honor these students as people first, not as violinists first.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I learned so much, Garrett, about what they like, what they don't like. And I'm sure there are still obviously hierarchical lines that we have to respect, but I do appreciate the honesty of students, where I remember when I first heard from a student, I really don't like this kind of music, but I respect our time and I respect that classical violin is the only degree that I can get at this point if I want to continue my study on violin. And so I realized that I will need to do a bit of translation. What we take in the lesson, I'll take with me, but I may not want to perform Mozart, after I graduate. And I remember in the beginning, I was very ambivalent because I felt like my efforts were not appreciated, and that it didn't have longstanding value, because in any kind of translation, there's some loss. But then also appreciating the fact that I finally was able to achieve a kind of teacher-student relationship where a student could actually say this to me without fear or anxiety. And so all of this just to say, I wonder sometimes, it's hard to say, I wonder sometimes if I were in LA and I did have, I don't know, almost the history and the resources of classical music in its most traditional forms, if I could not explore these kinds of conversations and relationships, because there would be so much more institutional and historical baggage in a way. I mean, I haven't been in LA, so I may be misrepresenting what's going on with programming and all the sort of curricular efforts. But I think with any kind of established city, what we trade for that pool of opportunities and resources, we give up in sort of the lightness of being able to make quick changes, quick and immediate changes. So, so yes, Garrett, all this just to say, I think living in Arkansas has its pluses and has its minuses, just like any place, I suppose.
Yeah. And as a graduate myself of USC, I don't think you're mischaracterizing LA at all.
Yes.
You mentioned something, classical music, so-called classical music's proximity to whiteness. And in this past year, we talk about all of the difficult conversations, the so-called difficult conversations. One of the ones that I think that we aren't yet exploring are found in that statement, classical music's proximity to whiteness. Is that why we celebrate Florence Price? Do we celebrate a Black woman who has achieved greatness, or do we celebrate a Black woman who achieved that proximity to whiteness?
Yeah, that is a complex question, Garrett. I think like all composers, I would like to believe that what attracts performers and scholars and historians to Florence Price varies depending on the subconscious agendas and values that they already hold. The way in which I will just speak about myself as a starting point. I had never heard of Florence Price. The reasons why I first became interested in Florence Price was because I was trying to honor Arkansan history. As someone who was always searching for home, I very much resisted calling myself an Arkansan. And I still don't know when someone says, for example, where are you from? I still don't know how to answer that question, not only because of the implications of, well, you don't really belong here, so what Asian country are you really from? I mean, that's a totally different area, but I also wouldn't know how to answer that question simply because I traveled around quite a bit as a child and even as a young adult. And so if we're talking about home as a duration in a community, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question. If we're also talking about a feeling of loyalty or pride, I also am not sure, because I've equally enjoyed all of my times in different cities and have very special memories that are not apples to apples. And so I always come back to, how do people answer this question, and what do they use as their barometer to answer this question? And so I found it interesting that simply because I still have family in LA, I still find myself saying LA as the easy answer.
Yeah.
But I do now, and maybe from a few years ago, started to think about, well, now I've lived in Arkansas probably duration-wise the longest. And now I'm approaching a duration that's even longer than when I grew up in LA. And so does that now mean that home will shift from LA to Fayetteville, Arkansas? I'm not sure. And so one of the sub things that came out of that thought bubble was, well, then I should at least know more about Arkansas regional history. I don't know if your listeners, Garrett, were products of public education, but as you know, with a lot of state public education, the curricula can vary widely. And depending on states, certain history programs, for example, will accentuate different parts of the state. So I have friends in Texas, for example, who will spend a lot more time on the Texas Revolution than people in California will. And maybe we spend more time on the Gold Rush, for example. Right. And so I realized I did not know much about Arkansas. I mean, of course, maybe it's just I wasn't paying attention. Maybe in history class, I'm not sure. But I remember thinking, I don't think I can actually recall anything extremely state specific. And so when my colleague was planning for this Florence Price Symposium at the University of Arkansas, I became interested to know more about her life as a contemporary and a colleague and as a friend of William Grant Still, also because of my own personal obligations that I felt as a person to understand and grow a relationship with Arkansan history. Also, my sense of responsibility as a teacher and as a musician to know the canon better. And so it very much started from a personal place, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I realized that, or at least my sense is that starting from maybe a year or two ago, this conversation around Florence Price has also expanded to be a symbol about classical music's exclusivity and its internal racism. Yeah. And so I actually am, to be honest, still surprised that my sort of, in some ways, very small conception of Florence Price as a local Arkansan figure, and also, of course, Chicago claims Florence Price as well, has expanded out to be such a wide and versatile symbol in a way, you know, for a larger conversation. So I am assuming, based on not much evidence or surveying, that part of Florence Price's allure, the conversations around Florence Price is multi-pronged, and that Arkansans, for example, will have a very specific, perhaps very regional relationship to Florence Price. And of course, because I spend most of my time here living and working, I find that a lot of the conversations that happen locally are slightly different than the conversations I have nationally. It just as a very simple delineation, I find that people in Arkansas will immediately attach a sense of self-pride. They will kind of couch it as, one of us has made it. One of us is being talked about outside of Arkansas. It's not just people in Little Rock, not just people in the university who are talking about her, but my goodness, there are people internationally programming her. There are people, so it somehow, I guess, legitimizes in their minds a figure that they claim as their own, making it out in the world. And so it's extremely powerful in terms of what that also implies for themselves, being seen. I even had a woman who said, I never learned about this when I was a child, and even knowing about it now, late in my life, empowers me to know that one of us made it. Yeah. And of course, nationally, the conversations are very much geared towards, I never knew this woman existed. Some people, I think performers, for example, are very fascinated by the mixture, I think, of the styles that she represents. And I think historically, it's also an interesting time because it was also around this time of, like, for example, I'm curious, was Price's music, even in her time, considered old-fashioned? Because,
Right.
for example, her violin concerto very much harkens to the past of this grand violin concerto tradition, when there was also this idea of being very sparse and like cerebral and intellectual and I don't know, I hate to use these terms, but it's historical, sort of this masculine kind of music where it's
Right.
like, uh, and when there's any kind of beautiful lyricism, that was sort of falling out of fashion. And so I also wonder if there were a lot of other conversations that were happening during her time. But all of that just to say, now in 2021, for people who are discovering her for the first time, I think the sort of expansive lyricism is in some ways very accessible in the best sense of the word, because
Yeah.
it's not like a Schoenberg piece or something that's just so cerebral and in some ways inaccessible. So all of that just to say, Garrett, I think that the beauty of all of this is that there are many ways to get to know Florence Price, and I think there are many ways to advocate for Florence Price. And I'm just so grateful that people are talking about her and are programming her.
Yeah, I have to admit to you that, again, something that you mentioned earlier, that question of where are you from? I've had I won't say a difficult time, but I often find myself doing mental gymnastics when, I meet Asians and Asian Americans, because when I ask, where are you from? I'm asking what city are you based in? Or like
Yes.
I found myself having to frame my question so it doesn't seem like I'm asking that. For example, if we were at a bar, I would ask you, so are you originally from Fayetteville? Or, because that is difficult. And I appreciate your naming that. To that, all of the places that you've been around the world and all of the audiences that you've shared Florence Price's music with, I wonder if a sense of home, even if it's, how can I say, maybe how can I say? You talk about, living in Arkansas longer at this point than LA and other places. When you have performed this work, for example, with the Janáček Philharmonic, was there a sense of home in your performance or your perspective? Did you feel like you were sharing home with these folks way over in the Czech Republic?
Yes. When I recorded this in the Czech Republic, that was 2017, 2018, which seems very recent, but as I'm sure all of your listeners will attest, so much has happened in the last
Oh, yeah.
year and two. And so, I mean, it really seems like it was a decade ago or even a generation ago. And, you know, I say this without criticism, but when I recorded this in the Czech Republic, the reception was not warm.
Hmm.
The reception was very much, and I think we all do this, and so that's why I'll say this clinically without a sense of berating or criticism. We tend to latch onto what we already know. So and we do this all the time. Oh, this sounds like this other song that I know, or this actually sounds like something from a movie that I saw, and I find that, for example, a lot of my students' experiences with classical music is through cinema. And so the biggest thing and the most common answer, if you play a Mahler symphony for the first time for them, or I don't know, a Dvorak symphony,
Right.
the first thing is, oh, it sounds like Jaws. Or yeah, or it sounds, and I guess that's a really dated, film too, but it sounds like Pirates of the Caribbean or something. And so they'll definitely latch onto these film composers who, of course, also owe a lot to Wagner or Dvorak or, Tchaikovsky. And so that when I was recording these concertos, that was a similar reception of these musicians. Oh, this is basically a second-rate version of fill in the blank, a second-rate version of Tchaikovsky, a second-rate version of Dvorak. And so, for example, there were some musicians who were kind of playing parts of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto when they were on break. And I don't know if that was just these musicians just kind of doodling around, so to speak, But I did sense a little bit of resistance. I did sense a bit of, what is this music? I did sense a bit of novelty, but the novelty sometimes was not met with an open curiosity, but more of a closed judgment about, is this really worth recording? And so, to be honest with you, I wasn't surprised, because I think this is one of classical music's plagues, is its inability sometimes to incorporate living composers and living music. And the living part is also underrepresented and historically overlooked composers. So, for example, even Florence Price no longer being living, the fact that it has come to the fore, to me, makes it contemporary. And how do we integrate new knowledge with old knowledge? I think classical music often tends to be very dismissive and automatically skeptical of new knowledge, and it prizes old knowledge. And so what we end up doing is replicating these problematic old structures in the service of trying, I suppose, to preserve a tradition. And so I think these critical discussions of, okay, let's preserve a tradition and our connection to history. No one here is trying to say, let's just bomb the whole house, so to speak.
Not most of us, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Some of us are, and I respect that, and I understand that. I was even thinking about your question the other day that you posed, Garrett. Have you ever thought about breaking up with classical music?
Oh, sure.
And thinking about, well, what kind of breakup are we talking about? Are we talking about a "I never want to see you again for the rest of my life" kind of breakup, or
That's a good
like
point,
let's break up, but let's still have coffee like once a year, or we'll still send holiday cards, and I still wish the best for you? Or is it a breakup like, well, let's just stay friends? But, and so I just thought, well, what would a breakup with classical music for me mean? And so I definitely respect those who basically have the breakup where they sort of are like, I never want to see you again for the rest of my life kind of breakup. But I've forgotten now my train of thought, Garrett. But all of this just to say that I think it's a very complex question about what does it mean to preserve a tradition when it has values that are problematic and values that I would claim, they don't serve modern society. And so, when we're talking about preservation, is it 100% or 0%? I mean, is there room for evolution? And I think obviously, if the answer is yes, there are a lot of different opinions on what that evolution would look like. And one of my personal quandaries has been, as I say, this idea of how do we integrate new knowledge with old knowledge? And how do we integrate it, especially when we're dealing with a language that is already old? So I do see sometimes this desperation for classical music to hang on to, I don't know, a nostalgia, a feeling, a set of values, which it doesn't exist anymore. And so for some people's minds, I suppose that is more of a motivator than to uphold it, right? Because it's no longer here. While I also think, do we still want to be, whether we say it like this or not, replicating systems of oppression?
Right.
Are we really okay with that in the name of history, in the name of connecting to a past that's no longer here? So I still battle through it, and I think teaching is a wonderful way to have access to these conversations that the Gen Zers are having now, and the Gen Zers are actively questing in terms of upholding their own musical identities.
And in addition to paying attention to what the up and coming generations are doing and talking about, my dissonance is, yes, this history of these constructs are problematic, and folks like my mother see a photo of Florence Price and feel seen and feel some sort of engagement. The question of, is this music worth recording? Is this just novel? I think the spirit of that question has changed over recent years. 5 years ago, the response to that question would be very different than today if we're asking, is Florence Price's music worth recording? What's been your response to this contemporary racial awakening, considering the legwork you've put into the music of Florence Price? I also want to pull in your work with the Fort Smith Symphony. I actually learned that today in doing research. I didn't know that you were part of that organization. I've loved them forever for the attention that they've paid to Black music. Florence Price, William Grant Still, etc. Well, so what's your response to everyone's interest in this all of a sudden, considering the work that you've been putting into this sort of music for years now?
I think it's great, Garrett. And to be honest with you, I had severe imposter syndrome recording the concertos, but I basically came around to confront my own idea of what a recording represents. And I think in that regard, also constantly am personally going through this butting of heads of old knowledge and training that I received and values that I received with values that shape me today by living here and thinking about how my classical art can continue to have an impact and express values and ideas that are important to me. I started this project just as Fort Smith was planning their multi-year plan of recording all of William Grant Still and all of Florence Price, with the idea, again, of sort of telling an Arkansan story in a way. And I think that's kind of this idea that I keep coming back to while living and working here is it's possible to have classical music that is also distinctly Arkansan. And I would not have necessarily thought that when I was not living here. And I think when I wasn't living here, the way that I would have interpreted that statement would have been a euphemism for a kind of lowering of standards.
Right.
When people talk about, well, it can exist on Arkansan terms. Well, it sounds like a euphemism, but it's really not. It's talking about celebration of distinct identities and a knowing of a community that only happens when you're not a tourist, when you actually live and work here. And I think there has been a lot of interest, going back to your first question about what is it like to be an artist in Arkansas. I think there is very much an exploration of the kind of art that comes through the slow work of being and living here, as opposed to just being a parachuting artist. Although I think that's also great as well when you have a megastar who goes on tour and visits all the major cities and has kind of a stop in Fayetteville before they go on to Dallas or someplace else. But my hope was always that this recording would be a reference recording and that it would inspire others to record their own versions and their own ideas and their own artistic values that could be expressed through Florence Price, and also, of course, then also champion Florence Price. I think, there hasn't really been enough saturation. I think I would love to see hundreds and thousands of more recordings of the Florence Price symphonies and concertos. And certainly I feel like there's a lot more performances and programming of it. But the work is just kind of getting off the ground in my eyes. I still grapple with, I think, perceptions that it's not my place, maybe, to be upholding this music. One of the first interviews I had actually about the album with the violin concertos was pretty shocking for me. I was not expecting it, where the radio host actually said, why you? And basically not someone more famous, And so it was a knock on basically my abilities as an artist. And then somewhere more halfway into the conversation, it was then, the radio host didn't say it in so many words, but the implication was, here's an Asian woman performing Black music. What's going on there? And so the first part of the conversation was very much, okay, you're kind of a nobody artistically. And then the second part is you're appropriating somewhat a different culture's music. And so I thought, wow, I appreciate these questions. I just wasn't ready for it. And so basically I said, listen, I have no misconceptions about the fact that I'm not name your favorite megastar. I'm not a household name as a violinist, and I'm okay with that. I'm at a point where, I was never a child prodigy. I just really enjoyed the sound of the violin, and I kind of enjoy sometimes the slow work that violin, acoustic violin, takes me, and I enjoy teaching, and I enjoy making music on my own terms. And right now, I'm able to do that, and so I'm very happy to have this access to Florence Price's manuscripts. And it was just a personal project for me to find home. And it was, maybe that sounds very self-centered, but that was my goal. I wasn't looking for fame. I wasn't looking for attention or praise, like, oh, look at me, I'm so special. I play violin so well, and I'm playing these concertos. And so I don't. The only answer that I can say as to why me was no one else thought of doing it.
Yeah.
A megastar didn't think to do it. And then the second part, I think, of the cultural appropriation, I think, is a lot more complex. But in some ways, my answer is the same, which is I understand it's not always about intent, but in my mind, I was championing a regional Arkansan artist. And that's not to deny Florence Price's race. That's not to deny her difficulties. But my singular and initial focus was, hey, this is a really cool piece of Arkansan history. And also, as a woman, I thought it's really cool that as a single woman, single mother, she was tireless in her efforts to continue to compose with financial difficulties, with the chaotic historical times, living in fear and anxiety, knowing historically how segregated society was. I'm inspired by that story, and I felt very much strengthened and encouraged by a historical figure. And so I was very honest and said I had not taken the time to think about all of these cultural appropriation possibilities. For me, it was like I was saying in the beginning, Garrett. I sometimes I solve problems just by washing dishes, and so for me, I was just trying to make a recording. I wasn't necessarily trying to make a big statement, and I certainly wasn't trying to search or ask for fame or attention. But I think it's amazing that it's happened, not because of what it's done for me, but because of all of the conversations that it's been able to inspire.
Yeah, absolutely. And for what it's worth, I have definitely spent a lot of time thinking about the issue of cultural appropriation, especially as it applies to this recording. But from my perspective, my ultimate gratitude is that the recordings exist. For me, especially in this case, it does not matter, what the race or the demographics of the performers are if this music has yet to be celebrated in that way. In my early days of radio, the number of people who would just tell me they had never even heard the name Florence Price, was so shocking to me that, putting music like that on as much as possible was more important, at least for me, than digging into the issue of the racial politics. With that in mind, though, with that being said, I think there are ways to engage that conversation, especially as it applies to today's society. There's been a heightened focus and awareness of violence against Asians. I was very much critical of some of the opening discourses I saw about how Black people need to step up and do our part, instead of actually naming and censoring the white supremacy that is really the source of it all. With all of those things in mind, Do you consider your work, do you consider this recording an example of how we can come together, how we can celebrate someone, maybe from different perspectives, but still centering that person and, as a residual effect of that, learning more about each other and bringing our communities closer together?
Yes, and Garrett, as you know, in the South, there is a rich tradition of Black and Asian solidarity. In fact, yesterday I was at a screening of a documentary, which I'm not sure will be available other than through educational circuits, but I do know that there's going to be a worldwide PBS broadcast of Far East, Deep South. And it's
Wow.
basically a documentary centering around actually a family genealogy project. But what it ends up doing in the process is highlighting basically the Chinese grocers in Mississippi and how the Chinese grocers basically, because they were also not white, ended up having kind of a Black Asian solidarity and developing a rich tradition basically of the Chinese in the Delta. And so to me, I think there are historical alliances that have existed that maybe have not been highlighted in the history books, but this alliance is not new. Maybe it's not prominently known, but I think the ways in which the different the Asians and the Black community have helped each other historically and continue to help each other historically. I see so many examples of it. And in some ways, I feel I see more examples of it because I'm living in the South. And to me, it's personally, again, very healing because my biggest scar and trauma from the LA riots was because Koreatown was very much a charged place where Korean business owners, liquor store owners often would have cultural differences and cultural expectations that often created conflict with the Black community. And that was the first time where, I'll be completely honest, I was ashamed of being Korean. And I just thought, what are we doing as Koreans? We need to do better. And in some ways, in a very indirect way, I sometimes wonder if my time here in the South has been a way to kind of heal that trauma. Because I see so many examples of historical alliances. And especially now, as we are talking about the rise of Asian hate crimes during COVID, but also because of all the civil unrest that has happened because of George Floyd last summer, especially on this campus, if that can be a small microcosm for the pulse of where things are, there is enormous interest in solidarity. Now, whether Florence Price is an example of that, I'm not sure. I would like it to be, but I think I still grapple, going again to a earlier point, I still wonder what the ultimate impact of classical music as a totality often is for direct social justice and social impact. I would say, having been trained as a classical musician, I still feel my personal voice that I'm most comfortable with is still in classical music. But I don't discount the fact that, for example, volunteering with organizations, with social justice organizations, would that create a more immediate and direct impact? Sometimes I think yes, and so I'm very torn sometimes about whether music does enough, whether music is able to do enough. But at least for now, if I were to answer this question today, I think I am really encouraged by the solidarity that the recording represents and the discussions that it has encouraged to further that question of how can we become a more inclusive and supportive community across racial lines.
Yeah. Music isn't the final answer, but it certainly can be considered a catalyst toward whatever that final answer is.
Exactly.
How can folks buy your recording of the Florence Price and learn more about you and your upcoming projects?
Oh, goodness. I am not a great self-promoter, Garrett. I do have a website that is minimally updated. I suppose my university contacts would be the best way to keep in touch with me. And in terms of access to the recording, I think they're available through all sort of major distributors,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
both in the CD.
and congratulations on that. To wrap up here, I kind of wanted to tie it back around to life in Arkansas. Whenever this pandemic is over, when folks can come and explore, all the beauty that is the natural state. I think Arkansas is the natural state. Is that correct?
Yes.
What would be your suggestions for folks when it comes to visiting Arkansas and maybe learning something about the state that they didn't know?
Wow. I think there are a lot of outdoorsy folks here. Maybe not surprising. So I think living in the big cities, I think that was sort of, for me, a translation process that needed to happen. I definitely enjoyed the conveniences of urban life, but there are beautiful trails and hikes here. Northwest Arkansas is very much gearing up to be one of the bike-friendly cities. And so Bentonville and Fayetteville's bike trail, for example, has now been completed. So people can kind of cycle from Fayetteville all the way to Bentonville and beyond. Of course, culturally, Alice Walton and sort of the Walmart family have been very aggressive in trying to build their cultural sort of statements of American art. And so, of course, Crystal Bridges, the Momentary, the Museum, are definitely places that people should check out. But also, honestly, I think Central Arkansas and also, geographically, Arkansas northwise is mountainous. And then, of course, south is sort of where all the rice fields are. And so I think if people are able to make the drive, I think it's about 3 hours from Fayetteville to Little Rock. I think even visiting parts of Hot Springs, for example, and Little Rock, one of the trails that I like near the Buffalo is the Goat Trail. There's lots of things to explore, both cultural and natural. So maybe my suggestion would be to have a cultural day and then maybe to have a hiking day.
Scott, it's a recording that I know, broadcasters and producers. We all know this recording of the Florence Price violin concertos, and I'm sure it's such an honor for Er-Gene Kahng to really be, as she kept saying, the reference recording for this incredible piece of music that so many people wouldn't have known otherwise. I wonder if, Scott, before we get into the triloquy, I wonder if you can speak to Price as not only the name, but just one of the names that we should be saying when it comes to the traditional canon. I feel like we get into this habit of not saying the name Florence Price in a way of proving that we know of more women composers or more Black composers than the one that people know. But what about lifting up Florence Price as the name that we say when we say Beethoven or Brahms, when we talk about an entire genre, an entire aesthetic of music? I wonder if you can speak to maybe one day Florence Price's name ascending to that status.
I think that she's poised to be exactly that. With the renewed interest in her music and with recordings like Er-Gene Kahng being the reference point, she set the bar high in that recording. And I think that people are going to say Florence Price's name in ways that point to other composers. Like, Florence Price got me interested in this instrument, or Margaret Bonds, because they were
Yeah, and the story, the
roommates.
history of their
Right,
story and
they
all
were
that. Yeah.
roommates together, and if that's enough to go, okay, so we're missing a huge portion of the canon in Florence Price's music. Let me go find what else is out there, and then maybe they discover Ruth Gibbs or Ethel Smythe or other
Right, Florence
women.
Price, even as a means for people to discover the European canon,
Sure.
and those women over there. Yeah, absolutely. Well, huge thanks once again to Er-Gene Kahng. I encourage everyone to go check out her recording of the Florence Price Violin Concerto, and to help us, as we say, prop up her name up there as one of the so-called Mount Rushmore composers of so-called classical music. All right, let's hear from another great black woman to get us into the triloquy here.
Don't worry about it. As soon as you step outside that door, you'll start feeling better. You'll remember you don't believe in any of this fate crap. You're in control of your own life. Remember?
Once again there, the late Gloria Foster, famously the Oracle in The Matrix. Scott, I don't want to spend too much time here because I don't want to keep it too heady, but in my frustrations with the week and seeing everything that's going, frustrations with the WEEK, and everything that's going on, it gets me to the idea of systems and systemic things. And in my most frustrated states, especially because I was sick late last week, shout out to everybody who wished me well on my Instagram story from my food poisoning. When I'm laid up in bed, of course, I'm going to return to, the TV shows and the movies that I love. So The Matrix is on that list. So I go there. And when I watch it and think about themes and connect them to the issues that we're seeing, it led me to this idea and these sorts of narratives and online rabbit holes as that describe the Oracle as the villain. And this is kind of what I mean by that in a nutshell, and I'll apply it to some art situations. We have all of these matrices, if you will, these systems, these institutions that make moves that are supposed to be progressive, in line with DEI. I'm thinking about the Met recently hired a chief diversity officer. Here more locally, the Minnesota Opera has newly appointed a vice president of impact. And of course, these are black people. These are people of color being hired into these positions. As the Oracle is there to sort of convince Neo that, oh, well, this is what you're supposed to do, and I'm here for, the savior of humanity. The Oracle needed Neo to do everything that he did throughout the course of those movies so that she could survive, so that the system, so that the Matrix and everything in it could survive, right? So this is so when I'm high and sick and going down my thought processes, I connect that idea to arts institutions putting in front of the world these hires of these positions that I'm not sure what they do. I don't mean to say that they're unimportant or unconsequential, but a chief diversity officer isn't as clear as music director, right? When it comes to that sort of thing. So that's all I mean there. So we see them putting these folks in front of us, putting these oracles in front of us, when at the end of the day, they are still a part of those systems and need those systems to survive, to have their own positions and their own jobs. So for me, that puts into question, is that sort of hiring actually DEI work? I wonder what you think about all that.
Just like we were saying earlier, that sometimes the melody is more important than the words. I think that the job description is more important than the title, because are we to assume that the diversity officer and the vice president of impact are going to have similar goals? Mm-hmm. Okay, so how are we going to measure that so that when the next round of layoffs come through, this isn't some line item that can be easily gotten rid of in order to save some budget money? So I guess what I'm getting at is, does this person really have any gas? Right? We were talking about, okay, so music director or vice president of
whatever, fill in
whatever,
the blank, yeah,
right. So, what's the job description? That'd be my question. What do
And
you
of course-
what do you want? What do you want me to do? And how are you going to measure my quote unquote impact? How are you going to measure my diversity gains?
But what about from the outside in? What do you think a Minnesota opera wants Minneapolis, the city, or the state of Minnesota to see when they hire a black person into a position called Vice President of Impact? What do you think their goal is? Because they aren't listing the job description or whatever. So what do you think their goal is?
Well, the Oracle, for some reason, was trying to talk Neo out of being the one. She was trying to talk him out of the idea of being, no spoon. So what, are they trying to spin what the organization does in order to appear as though diversity initiatives are working or are actually being followed up on?
And of course, well, quick side note. So you remember that Neo, this is how closely I watch these movies. You remember how Neo swallowed a what that started his journey?
The pill.
What color was it?
He swallowed the red pill.
What color is the candy that
blue,
the Oracle? What color is the candy that the Oracle offered to Neo, or that the Oracle was eating in the kitchen rather?
Oh, I don't remember.
It was red.
Okay. Now,
what does the Oracle give Neo before he leaves that first time? She gives him a cookie,
nice warm
right?
cookie,
and tells him that by the time he's done eating it, he'll feel better.
He'll feel right as rain.
This is someone who is in charge of an entire, humanity that is imprisoned. You don't think there's a little coding in that cookie? You don't think there's a little coding in these diversity statements that they put out and these announcements of hires? That's what I'm getting at. I'm getting at these hires and these announcements and these so-called DEI initiatives, not as things that help people of color and help marginalized communities, but fortify those structures and convince people that it is in their favor. If that makes sense, if you're following me with where I'm going.
And the music that was playing on the radio in the background is I'm beginning to see the light.
Right.
Are we?
Moving on. So again, like I mentioned in the announcements, our good friend Tamberly Ferguson, she had some feedback concerning what we were I got a lot of feedback concerning the King FM thing we were talking about last week.
Oh, did you?
Tamberly gave us something that I thought was really interesting. I want to read. I'm not going to put all her business out here, but I'm going to read a little bit of the email. She says, when we were talking about, and for folks who weren't here last week, I did a presentation for a radio station. They have a goal of diversity in each one of their radio shifts. I went through 24 hours of their programming and pictured all of the composers that are there. And of course, it's all whiteness, okay? And I sort of presented that as the visual to sort of stick into people's minds. Look, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. So Tamberly reached out. And basically, she was talking about how she believes folks in leadership at her station would respond, referring to listening tests and clips and that sort of thing. And maybe there's an aspect of that that's needed. What was your response to that idea that maybe we need to get back into the listening labs or really reaching out to the people?
My comment was that, first off, she said that the information that program director was using was something from the aughts, right? So we're talking about 20-year-old polling or testing or something like that. I do know that most major broadcast companies do invest quite a bit of money in focus groups or polls or things like that to try to gauge what works and what doesn't and how they can change. You were asking me about getting me back on the ship.
Do you think that's where we need to get back to?
No, I don't think we need to get back to that because the landscape has changed from that. We have to get away from the idea that just because it's a classical station and it's the only one in a market doesn't mean that that's the only game in town, because the internet blew that up, and then you have streaming services and all sorts of different ways that you can get content on demand. So why would you sit? You know, you have to figure out a way to get people to sit through something they don't like in order to get to what they do, right?
Or at the very least, something they don't know.
Right. So everything is, the landscape has changed, and you need to keep in mind that with all the options, you can't really have a clunker on your show.
My thing is, when we talk about the focus groups and the listening groups, we're starting off wrong, because if we have these lists of classical compositions to see what sorts of sounds people like the best, you are already defining classical. You are already putting what you can give this audience, give this community into a box. You're putting parameters around that. I think maybe if we started in these focus groups with people bringing in what they like, maybe even bringing in what they think of when they think of classical music or whatever,
Right.
and then expanding from there. That could be something.
I did get a chance to actually sit in on a focus group years and years ago at the station that I moved here from in Omaha, and I actually watched one of the guys in the focus group change somebody's mind on a piece of music in that meeting in real time.
Yeah.
So the thing that comes to mind for me is selection bias. And let's throw a little bit of Inception into the Matrix here, because not only are you selecting who you ask, what do you like, you're selecting what of this do you like.
And then even
So if you remember at the Sphinx conference at that one panel that you were on, and I came up and said, what do we have to do to get a focus group of the folks right here in this room?
Yeah.
You know, let's ask the people of color what they want to hear, rather
But see,
than
the thing is,
say,
when you ask those questions in those spaces, the people that need to be putting those focus groups together are not in that room.
right, they're nowhere to be seen. Right.
That's the problem.
Well, that was my question. What does it take to get a focus group in that room?
I mean, that's for, I guess that's for you to bring back to your job, huh? What is that going to take? You know, I remember being in on I've been a part of several focus groups and sat in on them. One of the ones that I took part in at my former job, the group was very diverse. Like, it was a great group to have a focus group with, but the person actually delivering, like, I was just there as a fly on the wall or whatever. The person delivering the information or facilitating the focus group was really dropping the ball, because they didn't know how to communicate
Sure.
with those people. So, you have to have those people in the room as well. So, getting back to the, diverse hiring and making up these things. I'm not saying that there, can't be any good, because I think most of these arts institutions need to hire people who just know how to talk to the people, who just know how to talk to the streets, because those people aren't there. So it's multi-layered. The other part of Tamberly's question that I wanted to get in was training for music directors and music programmers. What is the training? I'll speak for myself. In my first radio position, where I had full autonomy over my show, my training was 2 degrees in classical music and 10 years as a performer. That was my training as far as programming and all of that sort of thing. From the less classical music performance side, what was the training when it comes to being that curator, being that programmer, that music director?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're asking me.
I'm asking because you weren't a classical musician, but you certainly are familiar with folks in programming that also are not. So, let's get to that question. What is the training? What does it look like to create a curator of content who doesn't come from the classical tradition as a performer or even as an educator?
Well, that's some alchemy right there, because you can find somebody that has a lot of experience like you have, but they're afraid of the microphone, and they can't verbalize it in the way that you do. For example, the station that I moved here from, they hired a guy who was an assistant conductor at one of the big orchestras in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And, that's loads of experience. He was a conductor, for crying out loud.
Right. But bringing in that outside perspective is what was really needed, or what was beneficial.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Isn't that interesting? An outside perspective. Okay. Okay.
But it was still largely white and canon, wasn't it? Because that's what he conducted.
Because of the
Sure.
system that conductor comes from.
Right.
The systems that we were all bred from when it comes to our education, that whole big old matrix. So anyway, thank you, Chamberlain. Thought I would shout that out again. I got a bit of feedback concerning the King FM thing, but I thought Chamberlain was asking some really good questions, because I think it's probably worth us re-exploring and really taking some more time to dig into when we have more time, of the question of how these people are being trained, how these people in these positions of power, are being trained, know how to curate, understand, we can talk about, what's radio friendly, listenability, but what does that really mean, and where does that vocabulary come from? So maybe we'll have some time to dig into that. But as we wrap up here, just bringing it back around full circle again. I know this one was running a little long, but as things happen in the world, we have a responsibility to respond to them and to use our platforms to engage our audiences with what's happening,
Living in the world.
And I see, again, so despite what I might have had planned for Triloquy this week, this is an example of that, because it is my responsibility, especially considering that these are things that are impacting our communities. We are right here in the thick of it. So as we continue to send warm thoughts out to y'all and to the rest of the world, I hope that you will return the favor, because it's getting tense around here. I'm getting a lot of those DMs and emails that I always get, what can I do? What can I do? And instead of offering my classical response of, that's your responsibility, figure it out, don't put any labor on me, I'm going to tell you this. Start at your job. We just spent a lot of time talking about focus groups, talking about hiring, talking about, who is positioned to make folks feel like action is actually happening. Most of y'all are working at jobs of no fault of your own that does not center Black equity, and that's just the reality. That is not one of the center pieces of the function of these companies and these organizations. Challenge that. See if you can't push folks toward making the work about that equity, no matter what sort of work you do. See if you can, in the break room or even in the workroom, inspire the conversation of what it would look like for your workplace to center racial equity in a way that would manifest in some real change and some real progress. That's what I got for you. Keep us in your thoughts and prayers. See you next week.